I'm Ben Houchin, this is the Blueprint Podcast brought to you by Conservative Home, and we're going to lift the lid on centre-right politics in the UK. We're going to be speaking with influential figures from across the political spectrum to help understand how we can make centre-right politics relevant to people's lives again and turn it back into a political force for good. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Blueprint Podcast with me, Ben Houchin. Today's guest, incredible woman, fantastic Conservative. We're here with Nadine Dorries, the former MP for Mid Bedfordshire. She was the MP there for 2005 until 2023. Was the Secretary of State for DCMS most recently. Is an author and also, I would say, a minor celebrity. Nadine, welcome to the Blueprint Podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, first of all, when we do these, Nadine, before we get into some of the more interesting political stuff, we tend to try and ask people about their lives and their backgrounds, because often when we talk about politics, we tend to ignore the person and treat them as kind of some other being. So before we get into it, Nadine, lots of people might have heard of you and seen you on the TV, but probably won't know a huge amount about you. So tell everybody a little bit about where you grew up, what you did for a living, and just a little bit about your life before politics.
Gosh, I'll try and make that brief. I was born in Liverpool. I'm a Scouser, born on a pretty impoverished slum clearance at Breck Road. I mean, it's Anfield. People who support Liverpool might have been up there and know where it is and what it's like. I spent some time at Anfield Girls' School. We then moved out as part of the clearance project into a council estate in Liverpool, in Halewood. Started my life as a nurse, did 10 years in the NHS. Ran a voluntary school out in Central Africa for those kids who weren't schooled as part of the mine education programme. There were copper mines where we were. Then I had my children, set up my own business, which I sold 10 years later to a blue chip company. Had a number of blue chip, probably the top 6 out of the top 10 blue chip companies in the UK as my main clients. Incredibly successful. So 10 years later, established it from the original concept, and that was how I got into politics, because via that business I got to meet politicians and set foot in Westminster for the first time, actually, through my business. It was actually as a result of Harriet Harman, who was a minister at the time, who sent her civil servants to our offices, our head office, to talk to me and to have a look at the business and how it worked and how they could replicate what we were doing there into the civil service. So that was my introduction to politics. And the Children Act 1989, which they asked me to draft some proposals for. And that was like the bridge in for my business into politics. And so when I sold the business, it just seemed a natural graduation for me to move from the business into politics. And, that's the first time I've actually told that story. I've never actually... Never really, when I was a politician, did I even think about that. No one's ever asked me before, how did you get into politics, really?
And when you were growing up, was your politics influenced at all by your parents? What did your parents do when you grew up while you were growing up?
Well, my dad was a bus driver, and my mum did temp work, and then went and trained to be a teacher when we were in our teens. So. But how it was influenced was I grew up under Margaret Thatcher in Liverpool, and in 1958, I was born in 57. In 1958, the entire Liverpool City Council was Conservative, and the city had 8 Conservative MPs. And Maggie Thatcher in parts of Liverpool was popular, and we bought our council house as a part of Thatcher's policy on right to buy. And that transformed our life, really. It transformed our streets, it transformed our community. The packing cases which divided gardens were ripped up and replaced by fences. The dark green paint on the front doors was replaced by a rainbow of colours, where everybody kind of strove to project their own identity. Everyone was now king of their castle because they were buying their houses. And so that's where I grew up, in that atmosphere of aspiration and right to buy and Thatcher's policies, which transformed the council estate that I lived on.
Were your parents always Conservatives, or did they talk to you about politics in general, or was it this process that Margaret Thatcher went through around being able to buy your own council houses that converted them and therefore converted you? How did your parents' politics influence you?
So my mum was definitely a Conservative, although I don't think she'd ever say that. If you asked her that, she'd tell you, I think she'd tell, no, I'm not going to say, so my mum would tell you she's voting for whoever's the most popular person of the day, but I think she's definitely a Conservative. So, I mean, she's nearly 90 now, but yeah, she was aspirational. I mean, the people in our street used to call her Silver Heels because she was the first person to buy her own council house and the first person to paint the front door a different colour. So her name's Sylvia, but her nickname became Silver Heels because she was the first one to break out the mould. So she was definitely a Conservative.
And you said as you were growing up, you then became a nurse. How did that come about then? Obviously, with school, is that something you always wanted to do, or how did you come through school and then find yourself in nursing?
Yeah, I'll be honest, there were very few, even though we'd bought our council house and we were aspirational. The school I went to was not great. It was one of the first comprehensive schools in Liverpool. It was when the new Education Act came in. It was a secondary modern, became comprehensive. I'm not sure if that made it better or worse, but yeah, I mean, it was. I can't complain about it really. It was a good school, but I think for girls in my day, in fact, there's a boy who went to Oxford from my school, but as girls, you were seen as being someone who'd, have a family, get pregnant, get married, work in a shop, become a secretary. They were the life ambitions that were set out for you. And I just wanted to get away from that and do something different. And I also have quite a nurturing nature. So so being a nurse just seemed a very obvious way for me to get out of the environment that I was living in, to do something that I'd enjoy doing. And I was also very aware that I didn't want to do anything that was repetitive. Didn't want to go into an office. I wanted something that would challenge me every day with something different, and nursing really does that. And so became a nurse and absolutely loved it.
And separate from your parents, how do you think growing up in Liverpool influenced your politics? Because again, I suppose if you spoke to most people in Liverpool, they wouldn't necessarily speak fondly of Margaret Thatcher, irrespective of the right to buy scheme. How was it that it influenced you in a positive way, and it influenced so many in Liverpool in such a negative way? Why were you not kind of captured by what is kind of a very mass-held view in Liverpool around the Conservative Party?
Well, it is now. I didn't think it was as much. I'm 68 next birthday. I'm 67 and a half now. So I don't think it was when I was growing up. I've told this story before, actually, that our next door neighbour, I think it was either 72 or 74 election, and I wasn't old enough to vote, I don't think, but I was asking her who she was going to vote for. And she said, I'm voting Labour because that's the party for the workers. She said, but your mum, she'll be voting Conservative for the family. She said, but what's your mum got to conserve? And that was the first political conversation I ever had. So yeah, it was not everybody. I mean, my next
Mm.
door neighbour was definitely voting Labour, but not everybody did. I was younger growing up. I left Liverpool fully when I was about 25. I wasn't really aware of what everybody's political views or motivations were. But I was surprised as I got older to discover that even members of my own family were absolutely staunch Labour. I mean, my uncle, God bless him, absolutely staunch Labour, and we used to have some cracking arguments,
Mm.
but he just wouldn't budge away from that point of view. It's tribal, in Liverpool, it is tribal. And which makes
Well,
me laugh, actually, because I went back when my first book came out with Anne Trenneman from the Times. It was in 2014. We went back to the streets that I grew up on, and they'd had a Labour MP there for 20 odd years, and it was a disgrace. It was a slum. And, and Liverpool have nothing to show for having Labour MPs. In fact, Labour take their constituencies for granted. Once you get a Labour MP in, it's where Labour will focus its efforts is wholly on winning the next seats, not on looking after the seats that they've got. And there's almost, I think, an advantage for Labour to keep people dumbed down, to keep people, or there was, and this is where Keir Starmer is stepping out of the mould, to keep people on benefits, to keep people voting Labour, to think that Labour is the party of the workers. I think that's um, a deliberate process put in place within the Labour kind of structures over, certainly during New Labour and the Tony Blair years. I was really intrigued and fascinated, possibly more than many, when I saw the headlines on Saturday when Keir Starmer was going to crack down on welfare. You would never have seen those headlines under Tony Blair.
Yeah, and you think often whether that's is that done by design, or are they kind of really kind of jumping around trying to grab onto something to move on the narrative, because the first 4 months has been pretty chaotic from the Labour Party. But I suppose if you're
Well, they've just alienated another group. So
yeah,
it's the
yeah,
way they've done it. There's no finesse and there's no intelligence to the way, no political intelligence to the way they're doing anything. I think we're all very clear this is now like a one-term government, because they've damaged too many people too hard and too fast. And these people won't forget, whether it's pensioners or small businesses or farmers or GP practices, charities, hospices who may have to close because of the national insurance increase. They are using a blunt instrument on every policy that they're putting forward. Their policies are too crude, they're too blunt. And, there's one thing David Cameron said, which I mentioned in Downfall, actually. David Cameron always said, you can't introduce a new policy overnight, because you may win over half of the people by doing that, but you'll lose half of the people who are already supporting you. You can only do anything inch by inch, a bit at a time. And what Labour are trying to do is do complete policy transformations overnight. And I think David Cameron's absolutely right. They're losing supporters with every new policy they announce at the moment. And that's because politically they're unintelligent, naive, and inexperienced. And I think it shows in the disastrous 4 months they've had since they became elected.
Well, that's a very eloquent way of putting what I always say about politics, is that it's the old adage, you can't fatten a pig on market day. And the idea that you
No.
can turn up and just, it was one of the things that, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, how infuriated I was about the general election campaign. Which was, ultimately in retrospect, and I think many of us knew at the time, was not really about the Labour Party. It was about people wanting rid of the Conservative Party. But what that did is it meant that there was a complete lack of scrutiny or care about what the Labour Party were offering. And actually, what they ended up doing in the general election was not offering anything. And I thought at the time that was a very dangerous thing, because they were going to end up in power, having not really won the election, but us losing the election catastrophically. And then they've come in and tried to change a huge amount that they didn't at all signal to the electorate. Now, I suppose if you take that one step further, and to play devil's advocate, I don't think it'll work, but it seems to me their strategy is, let's make loads of really difficult decisions now. Let's borrow a load of money. Let's put up taxes. Let's do the things actually we always really want to do, because that's what a socialist government does. Let's fabricate this £22 billion black hole as a justification for it, because that explains why we didn't talk about it in the election. But actually what they're going to do is, in 2, 3, 4 years' time, there's going to be a nice budget, then there'll probably be a nice budget after that, then there'll be a few giveaways, then there'll be a whole load of spending that they're saving up, on the assumption that the electorate, this is their assumption, right, that the electorate are going to have short memories and they'll forget what's happening now, and they'll be rewarded at the next election when they kind of turn the taps back on. Do you not think there's any, you've been around politics longer than I did, Nadine, do you not think there's any justification that as a political strategy?
That's the Gordon Brown strategy. And if you look at Gordon Brown's budgets over the years that he was Chancellor, and even when he became Prime Minister, that's exactly what he did. You can chart his budgets. The first year they won the election, harsher. Second year, harsh. Third year, less harsh. Fourth year, giveaways. And in fact, I remember there was a time when they did the opposite of what we did. He dropped the rate at which people paid income tax. And I think it was income tax, not NICs. But he and all the MPs behind him stood up and cheered, because they didn't even realise what he was doing. He was actually scooping a lot more people into taxation than had ever been there before. And that was in one of his earlier budgets. But yeah, you're right. That is Labour strategy. That's what they do. And that's the Gordon Brown method. And it's kind of a very strategic political way of running their budgets. What it isn't doing is responding to market conditions, economic conditions in the country, the needs of voters, the needs of any particular group. It means that the economy is being managed nothing more than political gains. which really isn't how you're supposed to do politics. If you're there,
Mm.
you're democratically elected, you should be governing on behalf of the people, not on behalf of your own ambitions or electoral opportunities. And that's what they do by strategically running their budgets in this way.
I also think you're absolutely right, Nadine, and I also think that a couple of the missteps that they've made, I think, are more fundamental than the overall political strategy. I mean, things like the winter fuel payments, while in the overall scheme of things is a relatively small amount of money for the Treasury, the fact that they did that, I think, is not something that people are going to forget about in 2 or 3 years' time. There's certain things that they've done. I mean, I've been in politics as long as you, Nadine, but I feel like I've been in politics a while now, and it's one of a handful of issues in my whole time in politics that has had the level of cut through that it's had, where normal people who I've never spoken to about politics would randomly text me or talk to me in the street about it. It's become a bit of a joke with it, with, you know, quote unquote normal people who don't listen to politics. And I think they've probably underestimated some of that and that ill feeling towards it, particularly when you have the juxtaposition against, you know, the freebie scandal, the fact that, you know, Keir Starmer's on a private jet every day of the week, all that kind of stuff. It feels like there's a real naivety as to how politics works. It's almost like they pretend that they're above politics and can ignore it, and then just pretend as if all of this doesn't matter, when actually it's not about, really, with the greatest respect, Nadine, it's not about me or you. It's not really about the media. It's about how the general public feel they're being dealt with in comparison to the people that they elect to put in charge. And, you know, we all know that politicians are held to a higher standard, and they seem to just have a complete black spot when it comes to, or a blind spot, sorry, when it comes to this.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And if you look at the day they came to power, it's quite bizarre, really, how fast it happened and how
Mm.
cack-handed the whole management of everything was, from the amount of freebies they were given, from Lord Ali having a pass to number 10, to the clothes budget, to, you know, Lady Starmer's budget for clothes going out that day in one of the dresses that she'd been loaned by somebody else. And some of it I think was a little bit unfair. You know, if a designer wants to loan the Prime Minister's wife a dress to go to her show, she's doing it for the publicity and the photographs, and they're always handed back afterwards. But they left themselves open to have almost everything hurled at them because they were
Mm.
so it was bizarre, really. So it was just cack-handed the way that it was, as I said, lacking in political intelligence. They just didn't know what they were doing. And you just thought, well, that's it now. It's over. They'll get into an even keel tomorrow. If they don't, then something else happens. And the winter fuel allowance, you're right. I think that's one they completely misjudged that. And it was easy, you know, to see what the reaction would be. A large number of those pensioners voted Labour. They won't do it again. And that's a dangerous position for Labour to be in because, of course, their majority is wide and shallow. It is a government built on sand. There are Labour MPs with very small majorities, and they secured fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn did in 2017 when he lost.
Mm.
So they are not in a very stable position at all, and it's bizarre that they think that they can just continue to behave in this arrogant manner where you're quite right. They act as though they think now they're there, they can do anything they like and say anything they like, and they can just get away with it. And, you know, the fact is that's true. They can. They can because they're elected, they're there. There's nothing any of us can do. We don't even have a big enough opposition of the Conservative Party or a strong enough opposition to oppose them effectively. We have so many MPs in our own party on the left of centre that choose not to oppose them. They can do what they like for now, but, you know, in 2 years' time, when they realise that an election is now they're going to be viewed in light of an election, if they don't change, you know, it's almost given that they will lose the following election. And, you know, we spoke about, I think you mentioned the voter numbers. Most people stayed, the reason why they won so big and we lost so catastrophically was because a lot of people stayed at home, and they did that in 2007, and they did it in 2001, and they did it in 2005. The electorate don't forgive political parties very quickly, and they remember, they have a long memory. And so anyone in the Labour Party who thinks that, you know, in 4 years' time all this will be forgotten, they're completely wrong. The big question is, will they have forgiven us? Will they have forgiven our MPs enough to turn back to us? I'm not sure that is a given, and I'm not sure that they will, but that is really the big question that everybody should be looking at. And this is where, I have my concerns about Nigel Farage and how well he's doing, and how he's filling the political stage because Boris Johnson has walked off it, and how organised reform will be coming on in a strategic way regionally, how much money they've got now, how they're building up their regional presence. And it's not, although I say it's not a given that Labour will win the next election, it's also not a given that we will either. And one of the things that concerns me the most is the number of Conservative MPs I speak to who seem to think that it's now Labour's to lose. We don't have to do anything. We just need to stand back and wait for Labour to lose it. And it's going to land back in our laps. And I think that is a problem. I think it's a problem that Labour are doing so badly for the Conservative Party. I would rather Labour were doing well now, because that would make our MPs want to fight a bit harder and think a bit clearer about what they were doing. Having no policies right now isn't doing us any favours. Having nothing to oppose on just isn't going to win for us.
And I think you've hit on something there. And again, I've talked about this before. In the olden days, in elections gone by, certainly pre-Brexit, probably going back, back into the 90s and 2000s, it probably was the case where we had a much more embedded two-party system. If one party was doing badly, the others would automatically benefit. But we saw it in the Red Wall post-Brexit, particularly in places like Teesside and others, that broke those traditional links with the Labour Party. And we've seen it even now. We saw with the reform vote in the last general election. It's not as if because we were doing so badly, all of those people went back to the Labour Party. They didn't actually. Like you say, as you said, lots of people stayed at home. Lots of people voted reform or voted for somebody else and not the Labour Party. But in effect, they stopped voting for us. But what was interesting, there wasn't that switch back to Labour. And I think what we saw as well in the 24 election rather than, the 2019 election for us, where we got people voting for us for the first time ever in Labour heartlands. Like I say, generations of families. I think we've seen the other side of the coin of that in the home counties in the south and the southeast, where people have stopped voting Conservative or have chosen for the one time not to vote Conservative and vote for somebody else. And I think it breaks a kind of a cultural link, which means more people are going to be more transactional with their vote. And I think you're right. Any MP, certainly any Tory MP, that thinks that just because Labour are doing badly, we're going to automatically benefit from that, probably shouldn't be an MP, to be honest, because they clearly don't have a clue what they're talking about. And you're absolutely right. The issue that we have is how quickly can Kemi and her team get her act together to start to become a functioning opposition that is effective, because at the minute, the only effective opposition is Nigel Farage and Reform, really. And they're being very particular and very cute on the issues they're choosing to go on. But you're absolutely right. And you can see that in the polls at the minute. We're not necessarily doing any worse, but you can see Reform is slowly gaining. And I think there was a poll out recently that had us 3 points ahead. And that wasn't because we'd improved it all. It's because Labour had collapsed and all of that vote, from what I could see in the polling, had gone to Reform. So it is interesting. And I think the other thing that again, people miss with the irritation and the anger at the Labour Party is the holier-than-thou attitude that they have. I mean, I remember a headline that Lord Frost, I don't know whether he wrote the headline, he probably didn't, it was in the Telegraph in an article that he wrote. He said, the great thing about being a socialist is never having to say sorry. And I think this is probably where they probably won't learn a lesson in 2 or 3 years' time. They'll just assume that it's everybody else that's wrong rather than them. And again, we saw it, and the other thing that we've always seen is there seems to always be a tweet for everything these days. Is Starmer and the Labour Party went so hard at Boris. I mean, as you know better than anybody, Nadine, so hard at Boris over a number of years. I think incorrectly, in my opinion, on a lot of what they went after him for. But all of those chickens are coming home to roost, and all of a sudden, they're hoisted by their own petard and allegations of the exact same thing that they alleged of Boris, and all of a sudden, because it's a Labour politician, it's completely different and it's okay, even though it's the exact same thing.
Yeah, but you don't have the bad actors in the media working against the Labour Party in the way and MPs. The problem with Boris and our party, and how, my book, which is out this week, Downfall, which we just mentioned, the self-destruction of the Conservative Party, we were destroyed by our own MPs. if our MPs had put a caravan around Boris Johnson and protected him, he would have knocked Starmer into orbit at this election. He's the one person they didn't want to have standing. He's the one person they knew they'd lose against. And there is no greater communicator. And if Boris Johnson had been out in the election campaign, out on the airways every day, giving it the energy that he always does, unlike Starmer, who during the general election never met any members of the public and was hidden away from the cameras. I mean, I know Boris occasionally jumped in a fridge or whatever, but he would have, the way he communicated with people, we wouldn't have had an 80-seat majority. That is true. There was residual hangover from some of the issues that happened. But if MPs had supported him, the Conservative Party would still be in power. Pensioners would not have lost their winter fuel allowance. National insurance contributions most certainly would not have been increased. Taxes would not have been increased. It was always Boris's passion to get down to, I think Ireland has corporation tax of 12%. That was always his objective, to get the UK down to 12%, to make us competitive globally. Just different thinking in terms of the economy. The problem was Rishi wouldn't agree to anything he wanted. But it is a fact that if our MPs had protected Boris Johnson from that media onslaught, which you quite rightly point out, which cut all those brickbats that flew at him, he could have survived it. The problem was his own party didn't protect him. And, if the same outrage was to happen, if journalists like Aubrey Algretti, John Stevens at the Mirror and others, even, our own, and, the Times newspaper, all of those who turned against him, even if they all turned against Keir Starmer tomorrow and did the same to Keir Starmer would be protected by his own MPs. They would form a ring around him and it would be impenetrable because Labour MPs do that. That's what they do. They protect their prime ministers and their leaders. And that's fundamentally what went wrong with us. Our Conservative MPs chose not to protect our prime minister.
Why do you think the media did turn against Boris? What was it? Why were they so anti-Boris? What was it about Boris that they just felt like they had to get rid of him, in your view?
Oh gosh, there was a number of reasons. One was the new MPs in 2019 who were just totally naive. Said the most bizarre things to me, like some not too far away from where you were in the north. He said things to me like, well, Boris delivered Brexit. What's next? There's like nothing. We need someone else now.
Nadine was there at the time, particularly when it started to get tough. And there were lots of MPs. And you're absolutely right. The 2019ers, certainly the ones that I was speaking to, one, just hadn't been in politics long enough to understand their arse from their elbow, to be honest, and saying absolutely bizarre things. And also this kind of delusion that they'd won their seats rather than it being a Boris Johnson victory.
The thing I was going to say was they were actually saying to me they won their seats. It was their work that they did. It utterly ridiculous.
I remember you and I fighting at the time. We were speaking to lots of people and saying, there were all these conversations about, should people get rid of Boris? And we were saying, well, why would you ever contemplate getting rid of Boris, given what's going on? And it felt to me like they got spooked because they just didn't understand. They'd not been around politics. They'd not been around a crisis before. And so they kind of sleptwalked into, there's been a few bad headlines and therefore you just needed to go. And I remember speaking to a couple of them and I'm like, well, hang on, these things come and go. And they're like, oh yeah, but we're going to have the COVID inquiry, and then there was the privileges committee. And so they're all kind of saying, oh well, it's going to get even worse because there are these things coming down the track. I mean, is there not, again, to play devil's advocate, Nadine, get your views on this, is there not some credibility in that argument that things would have continued to get worse and therefore the MPs had to do something? Because, like you say, the media were after him and they weren't going to ease up. So if there was the privileges committee and then there was the COVID inquiry, it would only get worse and therefore they had to press the button.
Well, the problem was we had people on the privileges committee who absolutely loathed Boris from day one because of Brexit. And, there were those MPs that were put onto the Brexit committee, the Conservative MPs were, and I think we had the majority, were MPs that the Whip's office knew were going to vote against Boris Johnson with the strictest measures. So we knew that was going to happen. It was rigged. And, you know, I'll say that I was threatened with being thrown out. But I was I out of Parliament at the time? I can't remember. There were a few of us who spoke out, and we were, you know, threatened by going to the Speaker, and I can't remember what the sanctions were that were going to be put on us. But it was, you know, they constantly tried to shut us down. But, you know, if you looked at the MPs on that committee, they were never supporters of Boris Johnson. Of course, the other thing is not just 2019, isn't it? Utter naivety. I remember saying to one of them that you and I know very well, who pointed out to me that we were 2 points behind in the polls, who actually just liked being 20 points ahead when we won. And I said to him, do you realise that David Cameron was 13 points behind most of the time? And that when we reached 9 points, we had a party in one of the big dining room downstairs because we were behind in single figures. It was the first time we'd broken through the double figure negative. So when we got to 9 points, I think it was George Osborne threw a drinks party downstairs in one of the big dining rooms, and we were like cockahoo because we were only 9 points behind rather than 13 points behind. And they just looked at me with glazed eyes. And you just realise these guys just don't understand politics. So there's 2019 intake. That was definitely one of the problems. Brexit was another big problem. There were a whole group of MPs who were hardcore Remainers, and they couldn't forgive Boris for delivering Brexit, and they never wanted to happen. I think they thought if they got rid of Boris and got someone else in, that we could start to reverse some of the what they saw was the impact of Brexit. They would try anything to do that. And there was that. But also, there are also a lot of MPs that we have in our party who were brought through on the left of the party. And that was down to candidate selection. That was down to Dougie Smith, who picked every candidate. We had some excellent candidates coming forward for selection, both in 2017, 2019, and in 2024. And their applications, what they went through the process, was simply put in the bin. And it was because a certain type of MP was chosen. And those MPs were chosen because they are on the left, they're progressives. They want a modern Conservative Party, which embraces both anti-wokeism, which is kind of, you know, it's a bit of a juxtaposition to the rest of their core political beliefs, but they are anti-woke but also very progressive. And in terms of modern politics, they don't want what is represented by the Conservative Party, or what a lot of people of the Conservative Party vote for, which is fiscal soundness and to some degree, social conservative values. And so there was all of that as well. There was a whole mix, a very toxic mix of reasons why people wanted Boris Johnson out. And what they got was, you know, I know you said, because you did that article in the Times, I said and you said, and to every MP who spoke to us, if you remove Boris Johnson, you will lose your seat. There will not be a Conservative government. And it's really interesting because many of those MPs that I spoke to and said that to, and I've got WhatsApp conversations with, are no longer MPs because they lost their seats. But at the time, it was, they didn't listen to a word I said. They knew better. They thought their analysis of the situation was the right one. They thought they were voted in personally. They thought they would get this 8% incumbency bounce that Linton Crosby used to talk about years ago, which is relevant when you've embedded into your seat and you've been working it. They'd only just arrived. Some of those MPs, and I'm going to name some, Anthony Magnell, Alicia Kearns, and others, were trying to remove Boris Johnson weeks after they became MPs. It was insane, utterly insane.
And do you think, it also felt to me though, because of that naivety with a lot of those MPs and others, that a lot of that was driven because of this severe backlash that Boris was getting from the media? What do you think was driving the media narrative? Was that purely a Brexit thing, or why was it that? Because again, you and I both actually know. When you look at Boris, he's actually a pretty progressive kind of guy himself. Actually, he's not afraid of spending public money. He's got kind of our type of conservative, to be fair, Nadine. So it kind of feels like, particularly some of our media, you'd think would get fully behind it. Why was it that there was such a wall of anti-Boris rhetoric? I mean, I know that what the media would say, it's like, well, there was things like Partygate, and there was the Chris Pincher scandal, and there was the Owen Paterson scandal. I mean, these are all things that they should be reporting on, and it's not their fault that he seemed to get wrapped up in one scandal or another.
Because there were people working against Boris who should have been protecting him in number 10. People like Dominic Cummings and Michael Gove and Dougie Smith and others. As you know, they've removed consecutive prime ministers, whether it's David Cameron and Michael Gove jumping over to Leave, knowing that David Cameron would be forced to resign if Leave won, stabbing Boris in the back. So we ended up with 2 years of absolute paralysis under Theresa May, whether it was then turning on Boris when he became prime minister, then turning on Rishi when he became prime minister. There are a group of people at the heart of the party, and they are Machiavellian and game players, and it's about the game of politics and about power more than anything else to them. There's also, and they, I know, if you, in both my book, The Plot, and Downfall, I've done a number of interviews with a large number of people, both inside Number 10 and at the top of the party, who gave me an eye-opening picture over 2 years of writing those books. And it's the games they play. It's all about games. But, on top of that, you have the influence of social media on MPs who are very, very triggered by the number of likes or don't likes or comments they get to anything in particular. So take the Marcus Rashford feeding kids issue that happened. I mean, Conservative MPs went into meltdown. They literally went into meltdown. And it was 3 years before, it was only a year into the election. They literally thought they were going to lose their seats on that one issue. There would be issues like that popping up every few weeks when you're in government, as we can now see under the Labour government. The negative, it becomes the story. They walk around Westminster just looking at their mobile phones. They're in the chamber on their phones, constantly on Twitter, constantly on Instagram. They project their work as an MP via Instagram photographs or tweets, and that's what they think the job is. And therefore, if they get lots of comments, I know one MP that who was completely freaked out by the comments they got on Instagram. Don't read them. Don't read the tweet comments. Just don't read them. But totally a meltdown over them. And that's, again, down to their naivety and their lack of maturity, but also how social media, bots, how Russian interference in our electoral system works, how they're so influenced today by what happens on social media and how they respond as a result. And that makes it easier for the bad actors, those who are in Number 10 at the time with Boris, those who are on the outside in the second half of Rishi's time. That makes it so much easier for the bad actors to manipulate those MPs.
Well, if we move on to that then, Nadine, so you obviously last year released a book called The Plot, which has gone down very well. Certainly written a few headlines, Nadine. This is, I'll let you explain it to the listeners, but give us a little bit of an outline of the plot, because this is in effect what the purpose of the plot is to explain to people what you say is this kind of movement of people at the centre of the Conservative Party that you say have had a lot of undue influence and have actually got rid of fantastic leaders like Boris Johnson, which have caused the downfall of the Conservative Party.
Yeah, I mean, the movement actually is an organisation. You can Google it. It's got people have quoted it on wiki pages. It was run by Dougie Smith and Dominic Cummings and Michael Gove 25 years ago, longer, 30 years ago, back in the mid to late 80s. Interesting, in Kemi's speech at conference, she said, "We are a movement." They were her last words. It's very pertinent, those words. And they've been around a long time, and they were very much on the outside of politics, but came on the inside with Michael Gove. So Dougie Smith helped Michael Gove to win his seat. Dominic Cummings was by Michael Gove's side right from day one. They're indivisible. Wherever Michael Gove goes, Dominic Cummings is. Dougie Smith and Gove, they actually lived together for a while. They are very close. They're a very, very close team. They actually went to see Ian Duncan Smith and told Ian Duncan Smith that he had to burn, when he was leader, that he had to burn the Conservative Party into the ground. And from it, a new progressive modern Conservative Party would rise like a phoenix. This is an interview in Ian Duncan Smith's own words in The Plot. And Ian Duncan Smith refused, and he was gone within 6 months. And it's kind of they have this playbook. A complaint was made against his wife. It was called Betsygate. An inquiry was called. They weaponized the inquiry, used very negative headlines, used the media, leaked the media. Dominic Cummings and Michael Gove are both known for being absolutely total leakers to journalists and the media. Michael Gove, funnily enough, says, I don't leak. There are so many newspaper articles written about, both tongue-in-cheek and seriously, about him leaking, that it's, absurd. But they manipulated the media, and they got rid of Duncan Smith. And he was the first person they got rid of. And then there was David Cameron. And, it was David Cameron's book, for the record, if you read it, his memoirs, if you know what has happened since and you look back over date, you read, as I have again just recently, David Cameron's memoirs, you just think, oh my God, why couldn't he see that happening? He was very much manipulated by Gove and Cummings and Dougie Smith. And that's when Dougie Smith moved on to the inside. He then went into central office, where treasurer after treasurer tried to get rid of him over the years, but received telephone calls from Michael Gove telling them that he couldn't and he had to stay where he was. And they've just, the book is Downfall, came out on Thursday, which was the sequel to the plot, which charted the time from Rishi to the election and to Kemi. But it's been very well planned. These people stay close to power. I predicted at the beginning of the plot, when I first wrote it 2.5 years ago, that Rishi was their project. And when they tired of Rishi, they would remove Rishi and it would be Kemi who was next. And they are still there. Dougie Smith is still being paid by central office. He's still running the candidates department because Kemi Badenoch won the election. And that's what disturbs me. I've said that Kemi is now the leader and the members have voted for her. And as a result, she will have my loyalty moving forward. But I would urge her to cut ties with those individuals, to cut the Conservative ship loose from their malevolent influence, to remove Dougie Smith from central office. It might seem ridiculous that people would think, how could anybody have so much influence? Believe me, he does. And if you read the books, you will understand how. Some of the people who contributed to the books are at the very top of Conservative central office and have seen exactly what happens and how Dougie is copied in almost every email. So it's never seen. He's like McCafferty's cats. You just find the note on the Foreign Office stairs, never seen. Only one photograph ever appeared in a newspaper, which was taken when he wasn't aware. Never goes into a building without knowing where the exit is first. Bizarre character. And what I would just urge Kemi is that she cuts ties. And that way she will stand, she has the ability, she has the confidence, she stands a much better chance of survival than she does having these people in the boat with her. Because if she doesn't move the polls, if she isn't their guaranteed ticket to keep them in power, they will get rid of her too. And so what she needs to do is remove herself from them. But she will say, oh, I'm my own woman, Nadine Dorries is wrong, and she'll attack me for it. And what she really needs to do is take an honest stock of where she is and where she wants to go, and she is not going to get there with these people hanging on her coattails.
Why was it that then, given that this has been known for a while, as you write in the book, why was it that Boris brought these people in to number 10 with him after he won? Well, when he became leader and then after the election, why would he bring somebody like Dominic into the fold? Obviously, he had that very public falling out with Michael Gove the first time he stood for leader, when Gove, in effect, basically stabbed him in the back and decided to stand for himself, which basically destroyed, the whole of the leadership contest in 2017, leading the way to Theresa May. Why would Boris bring those people into the fold if they were so nefarious in the way that they went about politics?
Well, in the plot, there's about 6 interviews that I had with Boris. He contributed to the book as well. And I asked him that question a number of times. So Dougie Smith was always there. Michael Gove, placed him at the centre of the Conservative Party, and he's always been there. And people say, how did Michael Gove have that authority? Michael Gove and David Cameron were very close in the early years, of course, until he stabbed David Cameron in the back, and which meant that he now has no relationship with the Camerons, even though they're godparents to each other's children. But so how did Dominic Cummings get into that? How did Dominic Cummings get into number 10? It was because Lee Kane, who came from Vote Leave, who worked for Cummings, who was a Cummings guy, was working on the election campaign. And Lee Kane lobbied everybody from David Frost to other people, including Michael Gove, to put pressure on Boris to bring Dominic Cummings in as chief of staff. Boris refused to bring him in as chief of staff, but allowed him to come in because he felt that what we needed was a bit of a disruptor, a kind of someone who could help to get Brexit over the line. And there, there is no doubt that Dominic did help to do that. He was a disruptor, but it became more of a hindrance because of his bizarre demands. But it was Lee Kane who was, is an interesting fact in the plot. And I find it amazing that journalists never comment on this. I find it utterly amazing because I know if I knew about it in Labour, I'd be shouting it from the rooftops. Is that everybody in Number 10 referred to Dominic Cummings as the Dark Lord. They never referred to him by his name. Lee Kane referred to him as the Dark Lord. And I just find that utterly odd. And am I the only one who finds it odd? It's just weird. But there was Lee Kane, Dominic Cummings, Michael Gove, Dougie Smith, and Dougie Smith was in Number 10. It wasn't that Boris put him in. Boris never got rid of him. And of course, it was Dougie Smith who made that famous telephone call to Boris Johnson in the January of 2022 and said to him, "You stand down now, you're poison. If you don't go now, I will bring you down. But if you do go now, one day we may let you come back again." And of course, Boris didn't go, he stayed. And then 7 months later, they did bring him down.
And why was it? Why did they want to get rid of him? What had happened at the time that caused them to turn against him?
Well, Dominic Cummings did this interview with Laura Kuenssberg, and which is the last pages of the plot, actually, but in the first pages of Downfall, because I felt it should have been at the beginning. I put it in the wrong place. And Laura Kuenssberg did an interview with Dominic Cummings, and she asked him, she said, "But you were plotting to get rid of Boris Johnson." And she said, "Within months of him becoming Prime Minister." And Dominic Cummings said, "No, not within months, within days. We wanted him to be Prime Minister to do a certain job. But we didn't want him as Prime Minister for the longer term. We wanted him out within days." And he admitted in this interview with Laura, because Dominic just can't help himself sometimes, he admitted in this interview with Laura Kuenssberg, they had been working to remove Boris Johnson since days after he stepped his foot over Number 10 after the 2019 general election. And of course, the person who greeted Boris Johnson in Number 10 as he stepped his foot over the door was Dominic Cummings, who was at that point already plotting how they could get rid of him as Prime Minister. And getting the person they wanted, who was Rishi, who Dougie Smith had been working with for a very long time, long before he became an MP. He used to holiday with Rishi in California with his wife. He used to holiday, go and stay with them in Richmond. He'd been close friends with Rishi for a long time before Rishi even became an MP.
So how did that come about? Because obviously we all know that the leadership contest went pretty drastically wrong for Rishi when Liz became Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party. Was that them not getting involved, or did it just go wrong? Was that I assume that wasn't part of the plan, right? I assume what you're suggesting is the plan was to get rid of Boris and install Rishi, and then Liz turns up. So
yeah, well, it doesn't always go their way, so it doesn't always work. But Liz was never going to last. I mean, you saw what happened with Liz. I mean, they were literally press ganging MPs to, even the second time. So when they had the leadership election, Rishi lost to Liz. It was very apparent from the very first moments that Liz was not going to last. And that was because, if you remember, we had a conference very shortly afterwards, and Michael Gove could not have worked the TV cameras harder, if you remember. They were out to get her from day one. He was out there being openly disloyal, attacking Liz, criticising her from day one. Just bear in mind, by the way, the pound is in a worse state now under Rachel Reeves than it ever was under Liz Truss. And there is no media outcry, nobody leaking to the media, nobody whipping stories up with the media from inside Number 10, which gives the stories legitimacy. That's how media ran with a lot of stories. The legitimacy was that they were coming from a number of sources inside Number 10. So it was obvious that Liz wasn't going to last. So when Liz went on that 49th day, MPs still didn't go automatically for Rishi. They had to press gang MPs into saying that they would support Rishi. Boris had the 103 MPs at the point when he gave up. He was going to go the line and he gave up because they made it very clear to him, if you win this, we'll destroy you again. We won't stop until you're totally destroyed. And Boris said he couldn't do it to the party and he couldn't do it to MPs. He wanted calm, and he wanted a positive, forward-looking party that would move towards the next general election. And he realised that if he won again, which he probably would have done, that if they continued behaving, having helped remove Liz, coming after him again, I mean, Liz did some of it herself, but if they come after him again, that it was just being utter chaos in the party. And so he decided to stand down. I regret two things that Boris did. I think he made two catastrophic mistakes in his time. I think when Michael Gove stabbed him in the back, he did the wrong thing standing down. He should have continued. And I think when Liz stood down, he did the wrong thing not going ahead, because he was the democratically elected prime minister. He was the only person who had been voted by the people to be prime minister. Rishi didn't even get the vote from MPs the second time when Boris stood down. So I think they're the two big mistakes he made.
Well, I think, again, you and I were both there at the time when the MPs all of a sudden started flooding back to Boris after Liz resigned. And I remember at the time, a lot of journalists got a bit funny. And so some were even alleging that he didn't actually have the 100 MPs that he needed to be able to make it happen.
Yeah,
and he absolutely did. Well, and it was objectively true that he obviously did, right? And there were lists that, people knew who were on the list. But I think, I remember speaking to him and a couple of people around him as well. And I think he just felt like that had he done it, he could have done it. And I think had he decided to go ahead with it, he would have been the leader of the party again. But he just felt it was unmanageable. No, he didn't go into the detail with me as to why he felt it was unmanageable. You kind of suggested that would be because he would have just been at war with a similar group of people trying to undermine him. But
thank you for listening to the Blueprint podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home with me, Ben Houchin. Remember, you can like and subscribe on all of our social media channels, and you can catch a new episode every single Wednesday wherever you get your usual podcasts from.